Okay, I'd like to try something new again. Well, this is a live stream of a talk I'll be giving to my UP Film Institute classes. So let's just do this. So the talk is entitled Losing It at the Movies. So basically, it's a talk on how to do film critiques. Okay, so let's do it. So, your teacher asks you to analyze or critique a film, and you yada, yada, and more yada. And worse, yeah, a critique is not a laundry list of I like this or I hated this, okay? So, the best critiques are in depth, so malalim, full of insights, and authentically comes from the heart. They're actually very, very personal feelings that's expressed concerning a film. So, when you do a critique, you take into consideration some of the things we discussed in last week's orientation, like, you know, the film itself, who's behind or who makes the film, the people that the film is talking to, or the movie audience or spectator, and the context of the film. That's very crucial. And in the specific sense, when you're talking about Philippine cinema, what the film says about the Filipino experience or the subject matter. So each of these elements are excellent square ones to start your critique. And for example, let's just talk about the film itself. It can lead to a slew of directions or pathways. Like, and on a side note, if you're have attended the workshop Paano ba talaga manood ng pelikula, which was created at the cultural center, the following is going to be a nostalgic trip. So the four E's of film, or the four reasons why people make film. Primarily, people make film to escape or be entertained. So for a couple of hours, you're taken outside of your dreary existences, and you're living a different life. But aside from being entertained, a film also seeks to enlighten or educate, and most of the enlightening films come in the form of non-fiction film or documentaries, like the documentaries of Dizzy Carolino. Okay, and since film is technology, it's also a form of experimentation. People want to play with the different, technical aspects of cinema, the editing, the sound design, the cinematography. And finally, since technology is involved, film is never cheap. So some films really just want to earn. In an ideal situation, the four E's should be in balance. A film should entertain, a film should enlighten or educate, a film should experiment with the craft, and a film should be able to earn so that the filmmaker can make other films. And we can also talk about the four kinds of films. And I'm basing this on the Gawad CCP Alternativo, or the Cultural Center of the Philippines Independent Film and Video categories. Okay, most festivals throughout the world would classify films under these four titles: the narrative or feature or fiction film, the non-fiction film or a documentary, an experimental film. Basically it may or may not have a strong storyline, but it plays around with the craft. And finally, a special way of doing films. Okay, animation. And within animation itself, you can talk about all the different ways a film can be animated, from cell animation to claymation or motion stop animation to computer generated animation. Again, each one would have its own set of earmarks. And you can also talk about the two main pathways, okay, directions of film, which is mainstream. So when you say mainstream, the film goes through a studio process, and one of its main objectives is to make money, because mainstream film is an enterprise. But you also have the independent film. And nowadays, the boundaries between mainstream and indie continue to be very porous, which to me is a good thing. And you can talk about eight aspects of film, and it's important that you discover what are the eight aspects. So you can talk about the acting styles in the film, the sound design, which takes into consideration the dialogue, the music, and the sound effects, the editing, which to a lot of people is the final storytelling when it comes to a film, the production design, which is really a big army of artists coming out to do the look of the film, the cinematography, which is more than just lighting. It's lighting, framing, and the use of camera movement. Screenwriting, which is the seed of the movie itself. And especially in the case of the independent film, production management, because for the past decade, production means more than just looking for a budget, but the creative aspects of the film that goes beyond the production, like distribution. And finally, directing. So the director, as I always say, is the god of the production. So each aspect is crucial to the overall success of the film. And you can also talk about the four elements of a narrative film. They're very crucial in most film classes. So one of the things you can talk about is the theme, or what the film is saying about just basically three things. What is the movie saying about man, or life, or the world? And you also talk about the denizens that inhabit the world of the film, or the characters, and their typologies, their aspirations, their fears. And in relation to character, the major decisions that drive the story forward, or the plot. And since we're talking about cinema, we have to discuss cinematic style. And the cinematic style, as we previously mentioned, includes cinematography, production design, the action style, editing, etc., etc. So each one of the four units is a it's a whole. You can't talk about a a theme without talking about the characters, and you can't talk about character without talking about the decisions they make that drive the plot forward. And the one of the another way would be how critics critique film. I usually give this in more advanced film appreciation workshop, but let's just breeze through some of the ways that a student or a learner can go deep diving inside the film. One of the major ways is auteur criticism, which means taking into consideration that each film is made by a human being, a director. And since it's made by a human being, each one of us would have our biases, our hopes, our fears, our types of upbringings, our politics, our sexualities. So each of these aspects that create a human being will be revealed in a film. So a question that you ask in relation to auteur criticism is you cannot how can you analyze in Shang without looking at the life and the pananaos or point of view of Alino Broca, etc., etc. And then we know that films come in different shoe boxes. So one way to analyze a film is to analyze its genus or category. So a question you would ask when you do genre analysis is, how does this film push the genre forward? How does this film exemplify the genre? How does it go against the tradition of this genre? Another way of analyzing films is production history. Production history is just, you know, it's based on the idea that making a movie is a process. You know, you undergo usually five major process: script development or story development, pre-production, the production or the shooting stage, post-production, and eventually distribution. So production history just means you're looking at the film based on what happened during the process of its making. A nice example is if you know that in the making of Gone with the Wind, it took them 3 years to look for the perfect Scarlett O'Hara. So they auditioned all the big stars in Hollywood, and they ended up going to England and getting a British actress, Vivian Leigh, to do the part of a Southern Belle. So when you know this bit of production history, the appreciation of Gone with the Wind can be a little richer. And then, usually, this is done in the major film schools, social political reading. This just says that every film belongs to a context. There's no such a film that's made in a vacuum. So you can read a film based on what it says about the culture that it comes from, its attitude towards women, towards children, towards the city and politics and all of that. No? Another way of maybe looking at a film is deconstruction. And deconstruction usually it's applied to theater or literature, but since film is literature itself, you can use this to break down a film into different parts and see how each part, comes together and how it gives another dimension to the overall unity of the film. My favorite deconstructions are satires. So some of my favorite satires of all time would be Young Frankenstein and the Rocky Horror Picture Show, and of course Mike DeLeon's Kakaba Kaba Kaba. It's a mouthful to say, folks. Sorry. Then, of course, the favorite of very arrogant film scholars, semiotics, which is the study of symbols and signs and the systems of signs and symbols in films. When you study film abroad, I know that it would take at least a term or two to discover the trials of semiotics. And finally, close reading. Close reading is just putting all the different ways that critics critique film, all the way from auteur criticism to semiotics and deconstruction. So, literally, these are just some approaches that you can take to look at a film. So, your task as a film student is to discover your own pathway to film enjoyment. And that means you have to watch a lot of films, you know. You can't be lazy since you want to be a filmmaker or a film scholar. The number one rule is you should be like a vacuum cleaner when it comes to the watching of films. And number two, you have to watch all types of films. I mean, just because you don't like films or the films of Ingmar Bergman, that means you skip it. A good filmmaker is a well versed filmmaker and well versed with all types of films, even the what you call the B movies or the movies that you hate. You know, I hate a lot of MMFF films, but yeah, I'm forced to watch it. And you have to find friends or people to watch movies with, and more importantly, discuss your ideas concerning the film because maybe you saw something in the movie that your friend did not see, and vice versa. And in talking about it, your appreciation of the film just becomes so much rich. And then you also need to read about films because there's so much literature going around about cinema. And I'll include a listing of my favorite film books, especially film books about film theory. Okay. And I think the last but not the least is you need to explore the other arts. In order to be an excellent filmmaker, you should also know your music and not just music that you love, but expose yourself to opera, to reggae, to trance. And when it comes to reading, okay, sure, you could read about your best-selling novels, but it's important that you know your classics as well as your manga, comics, and other stuff. So the more you expose yourself to all the other arts, the more you become a more interesting person and a more interesting filmmaker. But usually, what I tell my film students is the best way to learn about something is to attempt one yourself, you know, make your own film. And in relation to that, don't ever be afraid to fail, you know, fight. What you should be afraid of is not trying at all. So, what happens to your initial impressions? Impressions or how you feel about the film is a fantastic jumping point for an adventure of discovery, people. The only rule is you can't be lazy. Film is such a joy, okay? So we'll talk more about how to transform your personal impressions into excellently crafted critiques as the term progresses. And if we have time, we'll have a session that discusses film as a value system. And there are two ways to go about it: film as a moral value system, and film as aesthetics. The topic itself is prickly, but yeah, no guts, no glory. So, enough talking, folks. Let's watch films. And in my classes, my live classes, I'll be showing examples from my favorite films. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed my very first live stream. Uh, I don't know. Maybe I'll stop live streaming, but what the heck? So enjoy the week, folks.